I'm Bob Loomis. My wife and I live in Marietta, Oklahoma. We raise Longhorn cattle and American quarter horses. We specialize in reining horses and bighorn cattle. In 1977, I was on a horse buying trip in Edmond, Oklahoma. And I went to visit a gentleman there. He had a 2-year-old stud I was interested in. And I pulled in the driveway and he was wringing wet with sweat. It was 105 degrees and he was hot. I said, what in the world's wrong? He said, well, I just bought 2 Longhorns from Darrell Dickinson, a yearling filly or a yearling heifer and a yearling bull. And he says, that bull jumps fences. And he had a beautiful little 88-acre ranch there in Edmond. Well, he was surrounded by multi-million-dollar homes, and this bull was jumping the fence, running across their watered lawns, and leaving big holes. And he said, all my neighbors are threatening to sue me. He said, I give a lot of money for these 2, and he says, if somebody'd buy them, I'd take market price. And I said, well, what would that be? And he said, $400 apiece. Well, I bought the 2-year-old stud, and I bought both them yearlings. Well, I took them home, and I lived in Nebraska then, and I got 1 calf out of that bull, and then I had to get rid of him because I couldn't keep him in either. And that's the last fence-jumping bull I've ever had. But anyway, I borrowed bulls from the U.S. herd there in Nebraska for a few years, and I always kept the heifers and sold the bull calves. When I moved to Oklahoma in '85, I had about 12 Longhorns by then. Well, I remember riding through the herd and looking at them, and I was always infatuated with them. I just really enjoyed them. And I always said to myself, someday I'd like to have about 25 head of the best cows in the industry. And just something really pretty to look at and get interested in. Well, I was so busy with the horse business at that time, I really didn't get involved that much other than just enjoying them at home. Well, in '85, I moved to Oklahoma. Well, as soon as I moved to Oklahoma, I started getting the Longhorn Journal, and then I went to a few sales, and I looked at some sale catalogs. Well, I realized that my cattle were average at best. They weren't the worst cattle in the breed, but they were a long ways from the best. Well, with my competitive nature, they all had to go. And I started all over. And I started studying where I thought the best cattle in the breed were. Well, that was a no-brainer back in the '80s. It was Johnny Hoffman and Blackie Graves. So I got to know Johnny and Blackie, and to this day, they're 2 of the finest men I ever knew. They were both extremely helpful. They were wonderful friends. And I'd go to their places and look at their cattle. And I always studied which cows were consistently producing the best animals on the ranch. So I went to buying heifers out of those animals. And that was kind of how I got my herd started. And then in '97, when Mr. Johnny passed in '96, and El Coyote bought all of his cattle. He bought the Ace Cattle Company herd out. He bought the Collier herd out when Mimi and Jail got a divorce. And he also bought a herd out in Kansas, the people that raised Doherty 698 or had Doherty 698. And a lot of good cattle. At that time, El Coyote had about 750 mama cows. And I went down there to visit. They were all, Pam and I, we went down to buy 2 cows. There was 2 cows out of Johnny's herd that I just loved. One was Delta Bunny. She was phenomenal, just a beautiful thing. And then he had a straight Butler cow that I just loved. She was a direct daughter of Graves 54, which was always considered Mr. Blackie's biggest horned cow. And this cow's name was Delta Sage. So Pam and I went down there to buy those 2 cows, and we did. But while we were there, Greg Briney gave me a computer printout of every cow in the place. So we went home, and it took me 3 weeks to go completely through that computer printout. And after I did, I pretty well figured out which cows were producing consistently, with the most consistency, the really good young stuff. So then Pam and I went down and we bought as many of those weanlings, yearlings, 2-year-old heifers as we could out of that set of cows. Mr. Johnny and Mr. Blackie in the 80s definitely have the best cattle in the industry. And after picking up those cattle from El Coyote, the majority of the cattle I bought were out of Mr. Johnny's herd. I bought a few that come off the Ace Cattle Company. I figured there were some Premier Butler cows in that group. And then one weekend, Pam and I went to spend the weekend with Mr. Blackie. And he was probably, you know, Mr. Blackie and Mr. Johnny were just perfect examples of Southern gentlemen. Just the neatest people you ever been around. Well, we spent the day with Blackie and we looked at all these cattle. And when I first got there, Tara Graves was a very young cow at that time. I said, Mr. Blackie, have you got any daughters of Tara Graves? He said, no, I don't have any. Well, if Mr. Blackie told you anything, you could bet on it that it was that way. Well, we looked at cattle all day. Well, that evening we went back to the ranch where he had his bulls. He was going to show us some bulls. And we pulled in there and there was a little lean-to with a little turnout pen. Looked like a place where you'd keep your horse. And there's the prettiest little big-horn ring-eyed cow in there. And I said, what in the world's that, Johnny? And he said, well, that's a daughter of Tara Graves. I said, well, I thought you didn't have none. He said, well, I don't. He says, I give her to Raphael that works for me when she was a baby. And he's fed her all the corn I got, growing her up, and that's his cow. And I said, well, would you ask him if he'd sell her? Yeah. Well, he's pulling out of the gate, and Raphael was just pulling in. So Mr. Johnny rolled down the window, and he said, are you interested in selling your heifer? Oh, he said, oh, no, Mr. Johnny. He said, she's not for sale. Well, I know Johnny well enough. If you tell him no, it's over. So I jumped out of the car and run around the truck to Raphael. And I said, Raphael, would you take $3,500 for her? Well, that was a lot of money back in those days. And he says, oh, Mr. Bob, I'd have to think about that. Well, we went back to Blackie's and ate dinner. And we went back to load up. We bought another cow from Blackie, and Raphael pulled in. He says, Mr. Bob, I can't take $3,500 for that heifer. He says, but I'll take $4,000. So I just wrote him a check. And I says, well, I'll back up to that pen and load her up. He says, no, you wait right here. He went and put a halter and a lead rope on her, led her up to that trailer, just threw the rope over her neck and tapped her on the back, and she just jumped in. She was halter broke better than most people's horses. Well, she was just a yearling then, and she's went on to just be one of the greatest producers I own. In fact, her very first calf was out of a young bull named Bueno Chucks I was standing in those days. It was a bull calf, and I gave him to Eddie Wood because Eddie's one of my dearest friends and has done a lot for me. And that bull ended up being the first 70-inch horn bull in the breed. And his name, I believe it was Payday Checks. And Eddie raised a lot of great stuff out of him. But that's kind of where we got started back in the old days. And people like Johnny Hoffman, Blackie Graves, Eddie Wood. And then another bit of nostalgia that's quite interesting. In the March issue of the 1985 Journal, there was an article called The Magnificent Seven. In the Magnificent Seven, it was the 7 biggest horn cows in the breed. And they sent people out to measure these cows. First, people called in their measurements, and then they sent people out. Well, they found out that a lot of people had exaggerated on their measurements when they went to really measuring them. But the biggest horn cow in the breed, March of '85, was a cow named Twist 21. with 57 inches of horn. The second biggest horn cow was Delta Diamond at 56 inches of horn. And she was only a 5 or 6 year old. All the rest of them were teenagers. And there was other cows in that Magnificent Seven, like Anita, Josephina 706. It was just, those were the elite cows of that time. So if you look, in 1985, the biggest horn cow in the breed had 57 inches of horn, and this is 2012. We have a cow going to hit 90 this year. That's what good breeding and serious breeders can do with an industry. We're also starting to see tremendous predictability in production of some of these top-end animals, which is something we also did not have in 1985. So where this Longhorn industry has went in the last 27 years is incredible. And I really think one of the greatest factors that has made the industry go where it is today is the Longhorn World's Championship and the Horn Showcase, which was Dale Hunt's brainstorm. Dale Hunt come up with that idea. He come to me, and they talked Don King into letting us have the first one. And he said, if it breaks even, we'll do it again. If it don't, it's over. Well, I took about half the cows I owned that first year just to make sure we had enough entries, and a lot of other people got in it. That, I think, was the birthplace of where we are today. Because up to that point, the cattle that was the preferred cattle were the show cows. And that was no big deal. It was all about body and beef, and everybody was raising show. But even in those days when the show cattle were the preferred cattle, you'd go to the sale and the big horn cattle would always bring the most money. So we had a market there that was being wasted. And when the Horn Showcase first started, I mean, this horn thing went crazy. The industry started growing. People started putting money in it. All of a sudden, there's competition. Who has the biggest tip-to-tip cow? Who has the biggest total horn cow? And I think adding the third category of composite horn, where you add base and add all three together, was phenomenal. Because yes, I prefer tip-to-tip myself, but we need a place for the people that have those big horned, high horned cattle. We need the composite for those people that can add base to the deal. Where I look at it, we need everybody. You know, the Longhorn deal, it's a great hobby. It's a great business. You know, when I first got into the Longhorns, it was strictly, I'd made my living in a competitive sport all my life, showing reining horses. And I got into the Longhorn cattle as a hobby for my enjoyment. Well, I'm not a person that can do a lot of things. I just have to do a couple things because I get so involved. Well, the first thing you know, I was so involved in the Longhorns and so enthusiastic about it, it was no longer a hobby. It was another business. The Longhorn cattle, if you get really into it and serious, it is a passion. And I really enjoy the friendship. We've made some wonderful friends in the Longhorn breed. We just spent a week. We went to Frank and Michelle Haverty's at Pebble Beach and spent a couple days with them. Then we went up to Justin Hansen's in Northern California, and his ranch is beautiful. And he's got a wonderful set of cattle. Like Rick Fredericks and Tracy Fredericks, they're very dear friends. You know, I love to see new people get in. I love to see new people get in, and I like to see them get started. It really bothers me when they get in the wrong hands and maybe don't make the best purchases and get disillusioned. That really bothers me because we can't afford to lose new people. It's really important when you get new people and they ask for help, help them. And the first thing you want to teach them is don't go by numbers. Go by one outstanding animal at a time. Just what you can afford. If you can only afford one great one, just get one. One great one's worth better than 20 just average ones. And one great one will make money. And then add to that, just slowly as you can. But stay with the top end. Don't mess with that low end stuff. There's not only no money in it, there's no enjoyment. I think you get out of it what you put in it. People that are not, I think if you really get people started in the right way and you get them with quality livestock at a fair market price, they're going to be a friend and a customer for life. If you give somebody an enema, it's a one-time deal.
I blew my